Okay, ladies. So this is the last part then. Okay, of the endocrine system. So we left off talking about the stress response and the role of the adrenal glands in the stress response. So I have a question for you. Remember, in this chapter, you're going to be doing some case studies, right? So you got to be able to figure out some symptoms. So imagine someone had an overactive adrenal gland, okay? An overactive adrenal gland. Now, the adrenal gland, we know, is divided into two regions. There is the medulla that secretes the epinephrine, which is the same as adrenaline. And then there's the cortex, which secretes other hormones, one that we could recognize. Sorry, actually, we talked about cortisol and aldosterone, okay? So imagine a person had an overactive adrenal gland, and you were looking at blood work, okay? The patient went down, got their blood taken, and you were looking at their blood work, okay? So, what kind of symptoms may you see? So imagine you were measuring cortisol levels, and they have an overactive adrenal gland. What would you see? High or low cortisol levels? High levels, right? What about sugar levels? Then they might be what? High or low? Could be elevated. What about sodium levels? High or low? What do you think? Overactive adrenal gland could mean more or less aldosterone. What do you think? More. What does aldosterone do? Makes your body reabsorb more sodium or less sodium? You recall? You remember? Remember the aldosterone works on a pump? What's the name of that pump? It's called the sodium potassium pump. And if you remember, aldosterone allows you to reabsorb the sodium and get rid of the potassium. So in your blood work, you would expect to see elevated levels of sodium and actually decreased levels of potassium. That's if your aldosterone levels are high because you have an overactive adrenal gland, okay? Eventually, at some point, I'll show you an example of an actual case study, and then we'll see if we can put together some of the things that we've learned to figure out some of these symptoms, okay? Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about is your reproductive system, because it's a nice example of regulation, hormones affecting the release of other hormones, one gland affecting another gland. Okay, so there's a bunch of hormones. We're not going to probably talk about all of them, but we'll talk about most of them. Okay? So, let's look at this graph. You guys familiar with this? Actually, not graph, chart. You guys familiar with this? Does anyone know what this is all about? No? This is your reproductive cycle. Okay? So, what you're seeing here is, now remember, a cycle means it has no beginning and no end, right? Or you can say the beginning of one thing is really the end of something else. Okay, so, in other words, if this is the beginning of one cycle, that means it was the end of another cycle. If this is the end of one cycle, it's the beginning of the next one. Okay? So this is your reproductive cycle. This dotted line, this is when an egg gets released. So when you were about 4 months of age, you set aside, this is when you were, still in mommy's womb, you set aside about 400,000 eggs. Okay? So you put them in the freezer, 400,000 eggs. And then you were hatched. You came out screaming, still screaming. And then at around the age of 12, 13, 14, you went through puberty. That's the point where you start to get those eggs. And when you take one out of the freezer, and you're going to develop them for a potential pregnancy, which if you get pregnant, I will destroy you. Anyways, because you're too young. So basically, when you have your cycle, you're taking one of those eggs out and you're getting it ready. for potential pregnancy, okay? This dotted line represents the moment at which that egg gets released. You can see that there's a bunch of hormones that are involved in this process. So we're going to focus on two of them, LH, FSH, estrogen, and progesterone. You can kind of see that the trigger, if you were a doctor and you want to predict when an egg would be released, by the way, that's called ovulation, right? It would be at the moment that LH and FSH levels spike. So if you were a doctor tracking someone's hormonal levels, you could probably predict that the egg would be released at a certain point because you can see that these hormones spike, and then you have this dotted line. And that dotted line right here represents the moment at which the egg, which is this thing right here, gets released. So the egg actually starts off as what's called a follicle, and it develops, and then it gets released. And then what I call like the envelope of the egg develops into this thing called Corpus Luteum, and it hangs around for a few days, and we'll talk about what it does. This is the wall of the uterus. You can see that it gets thicker over time. And because the reason why it's getting thicker is it's preparing itself in case there's implantation, in case there's a baby that's going to dig itself in, right? It thickens up, there's more blood flow because the baby is going to need the nutrients, right? The oxygen. Now, if there is no baby, that layer has to be thinned out. It's got to go back to its original size. That's when you get your period. Okay? That's that layer shedding. Okay? So that's the basics. Now let's talk about the hormones. So you'll see the role of, we'll talk about the role of LH, FSH, estrogen, and progesterone. Okay? So this is what happens. Initially, you get a signal that comes from the brain. So this is a neat little example of where the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. You can see it right here, right? Here's the hypothalamus. It controls the anterior pituitary through a releasing hormone. There it is. There's the releasing hormone, RH, which triggers the release of LH and FSH. Now, the LH and FSH target what reproductive part, Anika? I know you're digging the answer out in that textbook, which is not a biology textbook, in your hand. And when there's only 6 of you in this class, it's very easy to spot stuff like that. What gland does LH-FSH target? Yeah. What is this? Yeah. One of your ovaries, right? You have 2 of them. Now, what LH and FSH do, and you can actually see here, you notice that there's an increase in LH and FSH. Okay? And the increase, then you'll notice, look at that. Look what happens. It goes up and then it comes down. What do you call it when you have a reversal of something? What kind of feedback is that? It's negative feedback. Now, you'll notice that as this goes up and comes down, the estrogen levels start to go up really slowly at first. Progesterone levels are pretty pretty straight. They're not, you can see there's no increase here. So what's happening is the ovaries getting stimulated will release estrogen. Okay? The estrogen, you can see, has a negative feedback on the brain. Okay? Has a negative feedback. So what that means then is that the estrogen will prevent the release of more LH and FSH. But here's the thing. If you look at the graph, you'll notice that the... good, how are you?
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Is there a moment?
Okay. You'll notice that the estrogen levels are going up slowly, and then they start to increase, right? Now, we've talked about a negative feedback, right? We know what it is. But here's the thing. We've talked a little bit about positive feedback. Now, negative feedback will reverse a trend, Positive feedback does the opposite. It reinforces it. So what happens when estrogen levels get high? So when they start to really climb, the estrogen actually has a positive feedback effect on the brain. Instead of preventing the release of LH and FSH, it actually triggers a surge in LH and FSH. So it's interesting, the same hormone having two different effects. You know how we talked about a hormone will only have an effect if the cells have matching what? Receptors. And then we talked about how a hormone may have different effects depending on what cell it targets. Here's the thing. The concentration of the hormone can also affect what it does. Because you're seeing it right here. Estrogen initially has a negative feedback on the brain, but then at high levels, it actually has a positive feedback. And what that does is it creates this surge of LH and FSH, which you can see right here. So you'll notice, look, the estrogen levels go up, the LH, FSH levels go up with it. But initially, estrogen levels are going up, LH, FSH levels are going down. That surge of LH and FSH is the trigger to release the egg. Okay? Once the egg is released, basically, you guys have studied this. Have you guys talked about this in grade 9 health? Where the egg goes? Starts off in the ovaries, enters the fallopian tubes, right, and works its way down, right, towards the uterus. And if there is no fertilization, the egg just disintegrates. So it's got to hang around for a few days, okay? Now, the egg gets released. There is the egg sac, or the envelope, which is called the Corpus Luteum. And you'll see that it actually releases hormones itself, okay? So it's going to promote the release of progesterone. So you'll notice, if we go back to the chart, again, so you can see the estrogen levels are high, then you get the LH-FSH surge, right? And then what happens to what happens to the estrogen levels? Then they go down. But then you'll notice that both estrogen and progesterone levels go up. Now, when they go up together, what happens to LH and FSH? They go down. So what kind of an effect do you think elevated levels of both estrogen and progesterone have on LH and FSH? Yeah, you're seeing negative feedback again. So estrogen initially starts off as negative feedback, then it becomes positive feedback over here, and then estrogen and progesterone work together to have a negative feedback. There's actually a logic to this because LH and FSH cause the development of an egg, right? So here's the thing. Why do we want to release an egg and then shut down LH and FSH? Why do we want to do that? What would happen if we didn't do that? There will be another egg that gets released. And guess what the optimal number of babies is for a human to carry at a time? 1. Okay? So this will actually prevent further pregnancies, because you only really want to carry 1 baby at a time. Now you're like, well, sir, I hear in the media all the time, people have, yeah, it is. But what, if you look at the odds, right? I don't know what the exact percentage is, but I would say way over 90% of people have 1 baby at a time. It's very rare that people have 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Very, very rare. We're meant to have 1 baby at a time. It's best for us. The corpus luteum actually hangs around for a while. So this is secreting it's secreting hormones that will have a negative feedback on the brain, but it only hangs around for a few days. After a while, it will disintegrate, and once it disintegrates, the brakes are removed. So once the negative feedback is lifted, then what happens is, you can see, as the corpus luteum degenerates, you can see those levels, those hormone levels are decreasing. And then once they hit a certain point, what do you notice? What happens over here? You can start to see LH and FSH levels are going to go back up to begin a new cycle. Okay? Sometimes you may have a female that has a progesterone deficiency, so you could give them progesterone supplements, because what would happen if you have a female that for some reason her progesterone levels are not high enough? What could happen to that pregnancy? Yeah, because look at what happens to, look at the effect here. Not only do you have this effect where progesterone and estrogen inhibit the release of another egg, but you'll notice that progesterone and estrogen, as the levels go up, what happens to the lining of the uterus? It goes up too, to support the pregnancy. So if the progesterone levels are high enough, that embryo might be able to implant, but won't survive very long, because it won't get enough nutrients. And then you'll get, the pregnancy will abort, and then you'll start your new cycle. Okay? So the last thing is this. This corpus luteum only lasts for a few days. So my question then is, if we know the corpus luteum only hangs around for a few days, if you're pregnant, why does the endometrial lining stay thick? Why don't you get your period? Because the corpus luteum is gone, so it's not secreting those hormones. But what is? What thing is secreting hormones to sustain the pregnancy? I called it a thing, but that's kind of cruel. It's not really a thing. It's the embryo. Okay? The embryo itself, if you're pregnant, it's the embryo that's secreting hormones to sustain the pregnancy, to ensure that you don't get your period, to ensure that the endometrial lining is thick. Okay? That's the hormone that you guys test in the pregnancy test. What is it? You get like a blue line or something like that? Okay? It's the hormones from the embryo. Okay? So ladies, that is it for the endocrine system. And we even tied together your reproductive system, because you can see it's a good example of hormones controlling other hormones. It's a good example of different parts working together. And that is it for the endocrine system. The end.